Tonight, we descend into the smoke-stained world of Victorian Britain, where the promise of progress came wrapped in human suffering. You've probably seen the grand narratives of the Industrial Revolution, the gleaming locomotives and magnificent factories that transformed the world. But behind every steam engine and cotton mill lay a darker truth, the broken bodies and crushed spirits of those who fed the machine with their lives. Before we begin this journey into the shadows of history, take a moment to like this video if you find value in these stories, and consider subscribing to Bedtime History for more tales that illuminate the forgotten corners of our past. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what draws you to these midnight histories. Now, settle in as we explore a world where childhood was a luxury few could afford, where the air itself was poison, and where the very notion of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay was nothing more than a cruel joke whispered in factory smoke. Chapter 1. Born into the Machine. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones as you make your way through streets that never truly sleep. In the distance, the factory chimneys pierce the sky like blackened fingers, already belching their daily offering of smoke into the gray dawn. You were born into this world, not of green fields and clean air, but of brick and soot and the endless rhythm of machinery that beats like a mechanical heart through every hour of your existence. Your cradle was the sound of looms, your lullaby the whistle of steam engines. Before you could walk properly, you knew the difference between the sharp crack of a broken belt and the grinding shriek of metal on metal that meant someone's hand had found its way into the wrong place at the wrong time. These sounds were the vocabulary of your childhood, teaching you a language of danger and desperation that no child should ever need to learn. In the tenements where you grew up, families pressed together like books on a shelf. There was no time for games or wonder. Your parents, if they both survived the mills long enough to see you born, worked shifts that meant you might see them for an hour each day, their faces gray with exhaustion and fiber dust. They aged in dog years, 10 for every one that passed, their backs bent by work that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep you alive for another day's labor. The neighborhood children weren't children in any sense that earlier generations would recognize. They were small adults with hollow eyes and careful movements, already learning to conserve energy for the long hours ahead. You played games of factory, not house, mimicking the motions of weavers and spinners with broken sticks and scraps of cloth. Your toys were the things that fell from wagons, bent nails and pieces of string, treasures salvaged from the industrial waste that littered every street. By age 4, you knew the way to the factory gates by heart, not because anyone taught you, but because survival meant knowing every shortcut through the maze of identical brick buildings that housed the machinery of progress. The gutters ran with colors no natural stream had ever known, dyes and chemicals creating rainbow slicks that you learned not to splash through after seeing what happened to the cat that drank from them. Your education came from necessity, not books. You learned to count by watching your mother divide a single loaf of bread among too many mouths. You learn about time from the factory whistles that split the day into segments of work and brief, precious moments of rest. Reading was a luxury for children who weren't needed to contribute every possible penny to keep the family from starvation or eviction. The concept of childhood as a protected time of growth and learning was as foreign to your world as the idea of vacations or weekends. You were an economic unit from the moment you could walk, a small pair of hands that could reach into spaces too narrow for adults, a body light enough to crawl under moving machinery without stopping production. The factory owners looked at you and saw not a developing human being, but a solution to their labor problems. Your body developed differently than children in other times and places. Poor nutrition stunted your growth, while heavy labor broadened your shoulders and strengthened your arms in ways that made you look like a miniature adult. Your hands, rough with calluses before you lost your first tooth, moved with the precise efficiency of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. Every movement was calculated to avoid injury while maximizing output, a dance of survival choreographed by necessity. The air you breathed carried the signature of industry, thick with particles that settled in your lungs and would never leave. You coughed the productive cough of mill workers before you learned to write your name, your body already adapting to an environment that was slowly poisoning you. The taste of metal and cotton fiber became so familiar that clean air, when you occasionally encountered it, seemed thin and strange. Your dreams were filled with the sounds of machinery, great wheels turning and pistons pumping in rhythms that followed you into sleep. Even in rest, your mind couldn't escape the industrial symphony that provided the soundtrack to your existence. You dreamed of gears and belts, of endless rows of looms stretching into darkness, of the satisfied smile of an overseer when production quotas were met. The seasons meant little in your world. Winter brought the added misery of cold buildings where the only warmth came from the friction of moving parts and the press of bodies working in close quarters. Summer intensified the heat from machinery until the factory floors became furnaces where workers collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. Spring and autumn were simply variations on the theme of work, 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 until your body gave out or the machinery finally killed you. This was your inheritance, not land or money or education, but a place in the great machine that was transforming the world. You were born to be consumed by progress, to feed your life into the engines of change so that others, somewhere far from the factory floors, could enjoy the fruits of industrial advancement. Your childhood was a brief intermission before the real performance began, and the curtain was already rising on a life that would demand everything you had to give and more than you could afford to lose. Chapter 2. Your Factory Childhood. At 5 years old, when children in Otherworld were learning to tie their shoes and recite nursery rhymes, you were learning to tie broken threads and dodge moving machinery. Your first day in the factory arrived not with ceremony, but with grim necessity. Your family's survival depending on the few coins your small hands could earn in the depths of the industrial machine. The factory floors stretched before you like a mechanical canyon, filled with looms that towered overhead like metal trees bearing fruit of cotton and wool. The noise hit you like a physical force, a wall of sound so intense that conversation became impossible. Workers communicated through gestures and facial expressions, a silent language born from the impossibility of speech over the thunder of industry. Your ears would ring for weeks until they adapted, learning to filter the mechanical symphony into manageable segments of sound. Your job was to crawl, specifically to crawl under the moving machinery while it operated, collecting the cotton fibers that fell to the floor and cleaning the oil that dripped from the mechanical joints above. Adult bodies were too large for these spaces, but a child's small frame could slip between the spinning wheels and moving belts, gathering the industrial debris that would otherwise gum up the works and slow production. The space beneath the looms was a twilight world of shadows and danger. Metal teeth clicked and snapped inches from your head as you worked, the rhythm hypnotic and terrifying. The floor was slick with oil and fiber, creating a surface where one wrong move could send you sliding into moving parts that wouldn't distinguish between a cotton thread and a child's finger. You learned to move with the fluid grace of water, flowing around obstacles and timing your movements to the mechanical rhythms that governed every second of your existence. Your supervisor was a piece-rate worker whose pay depended on keeping the machines running at maximum efficiency. To him, you were a tool, no different from a wrench or oil can, something to be used until it broke and then replaced. He communicated with you through kicks and shoves, saving his voice for the adults whose work could affect his own earnings. If you moved too slowly or failed to clean thoroughly enough, His boot would find your ribs with practiced accuracy. The other children in the factory became your family in ways your actual relatives never could. You shared the unique understanding that came from breathing the same poisoned air and dodging the same mechanical hazards. You developed a network of signals and codes, ways to warn each other about loose belts or overheated bearings, small acts of solidarity that sometimes meant the difference between going home with all your fingers and leaving pieces of yourself behind in the machinery. Hunger was your constant companion, a hollow ache that gnawed at your concentration and made the simplest tasks feel monumental. Your one meal per day, if you could call it that, consisted of bread and water, occasionally supplemented with a thin gruel that tasted of nothing and everything wrong. You learned to work while dizzy from lack of food, to maintain focus when your body was consuming itself, to keep functioning. The factory operated by candlelight and oil lamps, creating a world of flickering shadows where depth perception became a survival skill. The combination of poor lighting and exhaustion led to accidents that the overseers treated as minor inconveniences rather than human tragedies. A child losing a finger to a loom was noted in the ledger books only as a slight decrease in productivity, the cost of replacement workers already calculated into the profit margins. Your education in mechanical arts was comprehensive and brutal. You learned to identify the warning sounds that preceded equipment failure, the slight change in pitch that indicated a belt was about to snap or a bearing was running dry. This knowledge was your life insurance, the difference between surviving another day and becoming another statistic in the Industrial Revolution's human cost accounting. The factory children developed a peculiar relationship with time. Minutes stretched like hours when you were trapped beneath moving machinery, but days passed in a blur of repetitive motion and mechanical noise. You aged not in years, but in scars, each injury marking another lesson learned in the University of Industrial Survival. Sleep, when it finally came, offered little respite. Your body ached in places you hadn't known could hurt, and your dreams were haunted by the sounds and sights of the factory floor. You would wake to find your hands still moving in the motions of work, your body so conditioned to the rhythms of production that rest became another form of labor. The adults around you moved like ghosts, their spirits ground down by years of the same routine that was just beginning for you. They had learned not to see the children as children, but as necessary components in the industrial process. To acknowledge your humanity would have made their own survival impossible. So they developed a selective blindness that allowed them to function in a system that demanded the sacrifice of innocence for the sake of progress. Your clothes, such as they were, bore the permanent stains of your labor. Cotton fibers embedded themselves in the fabric until your shirt became a textile archaeological record of your work. The oil stains created patterns that told the story of which machines you had crawled under, which leaks you had cleaned, which mechanical hazards you had navigated in your daily survival routine. This was childhood in the age of steam and steel, a time when progress demanded sacrifices that were measured not in money, but in human potential. You were growing up inside the machine, your development shaped by the needs of industry rather than the natural progression of human growth. Every day taught you new lessons about survival, endurance, and the precise mathematics of how little a human life was worth when weighed against the demands of mechanical efficiency. Chapter 3. The Death Traps. The factory floor was a carefully designed death trap, a maze of unguarded machinery where every step carried the potential for catastrophe. The engineers who built these mechanical monsters had considered safety features an unnecessary expense, extra costs that would eat into profits without adding to production. Your workplace was a testament to the philosophy that human lives were cheaper than safety equipment, that workers could be replaced more easily than machines could be retrofitted with protective guards. The main production floor stretched the length of several city blocks, filled with power looms that operated at speeds that defied human reflexes. Leather belts, some as wide as a man's chest, carried power from the main drive shaft to individual machines, creating a network of moving surfaces that could grab clothing, hair, or limbs and drag workers into mechanical jaws that knew no mercy. These belts ran overhead, at shoulder height, and along the floor, creating a three-dimensional maze of crushing hazards that workers had to navigate hundreds of times each day. The air itself was a weapon. Cotton fibers filled the atmosphere so thickly that breathing became a conscious effort, each inhalation drawing microscopic daggers into your lungs. The fiber clouds were so dense that visibility dropped to mere feet, creating a world where workers stumbled blindly between machines, guided only by sound and muscle memory. These floating particles didn't just make breathing difficult. They created an explosive atmosphere where a single spark could turn the entire factory into an inferno. Heat radiated from every surface. The friction of leather on metal, the steam from cleaning processes, the warmth generated by hundreds of human bodies working in close quarters, all combined to create temperatures that regularly climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Workers collapsed from heat exhaustion with predictable regularity, their unconscious bodies dragged aside just long enough to clear the workspace before production resumed. The factory owners considered fans an unnecessary luxury, and windows, when they existed at all, were kept closed to prevent drafts that might affect the machinery's performance. The floors were deliberately designed to maximize danger rather than minimize it. Uneven wooden planks, slick with oil and water, created surfaces where even experienced workers stumbled daily. Gaps between boards caught feet and ankles, sending workers tumbling into machinery or causing them to drop materials that would then need to be retrieved from dangerous locations. The floor drains, when they functioned at all, carried away not just water but blood, creating an ecosystem where industrial waste and human suffering flowed together toward the same destination. Lighting consisted of gas jets and oil lamps that cast dancing shadows and created heat sources that added to the already unbearable working conditions. These open flames, surrounded by cotton fibers and oil vapors, turned every workday into a game of chance where the stakes were measured in human lives. The irregular illumination created blind spots where workers operated by feel alone, their hands moving between spinning parts guided only by experience and prayer. The machinery itself was a collection of improvised modifications and dangerous shortcuts. Gears operated without guards, creating mechanical mouths that could strip flesh from bone in milliseconds. Pulleys and drive wheels spun at eye level, their edges sharp enough to scalp an unwary worker who leaned too close. The looms themselves were temperamental beasts that required constant adjustment, forcing workers to reach into moving mechanisms to clear jams or replace broken parts while the machinery continued to operate. Ventilation was not designed for human comfort, but for the machinery's needs. The air circulation systems, such as they were engineered to remove excess heat from the mechanical components while paying no attention to the carbon dioxide buildup that left workers dizzy and disoriented. Fresh air was considered a waste of energy that could be better spent on production, so workers labored in an atmosphere that was slowly suffocating them. The building structure itself was a monument to corner cutting and cost reduction. Load-bearing walls were built to minimum specifications, creating structures that swayed and creaked under the constant vibration of heavy machinery. The foundations, often built on filled land or inadequate footings, settled unevenly, causing floors to slope and creating additional hazards for workers who were already navigating an obstacle course of mechanical dangers. Fire was an ever-present threat that the factory owners addressed through fatalistic acceptance rather than prevention. Fire escapes, when they existed, were narrow staircases that could accommodate only a fraction of the workforce in case of emergency. Exit doors were often locked during working hours to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, trapping workers inside buildings that were essentially giant tinderboxes filled with combustible materials and ignition sources. The water systems, designed primarily for the machinery's cooling needs, created their own hazards. Pipes ran overhead without protective casings, regularly bursting and sending scalding water cascading onto workers below. The steam systems that powered the machinery leaked constantly, creating clouds of superheated vapor that could cook human flesh in seconds. Maintenance on these systems was performed while they operated because stopping production for safety work was considered financially unacceptable. Waste disposal was handled through the simple expedient of dumping everything into the nearest river or vacant lot. Chemical runoff, metal shavings, textile waste, and human waste all flowed together, creating toxic environments that poisoned the air and water around the factory. Workers had no choice but to live in these contaminated zones, their homes built on industrial waste sites that continued to leach poisons into their daily lives. This was your workplace, a carefully engineered environment where every surface, every machine, every breath of air carried the potential for injury or death. The factory owners had calculated the cost of human suffering against the expense of safety measures and found that human lives came cheaper. You worked in a mechanical slaughterhouse where the product being processed was not just cotton or wool, but human bodies and souls, ground up and consumed by the relentless hunger of industrial progress. Chapter 4. The Killing Hours. The day began before dawn with the shriek of factory whistles that could wake the dead, and probably did. By 5 in the morning, you were already stumbling through streets lit only by the occasional gas lamp, your body still heavy with exhaustion from the previous day's labor. The working day stretched ahead like a prison sentence, 16 hours of mechanical repetition that would test every limit of human endurance and then demand more than you had to give. Your workstation was a small section of floor space beside a power loom, a mechanical monster that never stopped moving, never paused for breath, never acknowledged that the person tending it was made of flesh rather than iron. The loom's rhythm became your heartbeat, its demands the only schedule that mattered in your life. Each piece of work had to be completed in precisely the same amount of time, with no allowance for fatigue, illness, or the simple human need to rest. Standing was not a choice, but a requirement. The factory floor offered no chairs, no benches, no opportunity to shift your weight or relieve the pressure on joints that were already protesting after the first hour. Your legs learned to lock in position, transforming into pillars of muscle and bone that could support your weight through the endless day. By noon, your feet had swollen beyond the capacity of your shoes, creating pressure points that sent shooting pains up your legs with every step. The lunch break, if it could be called that, lasted 30 minutes and required you to remain standing. Workers clustered around the few water buckets, sharing ladles that carried the germs and diseases of everyone who had drunk before them. Food was whatever you could carry in your pockets, usually bread that had gone stale and cheese that had begun to turn. You ate while standing, while listening to the machinery that continued to operate in other sections of the factory, a reminder that rest was temporary and production was eternal. The afternoon brought its own special torments. The heat from the machinery, combined with the warmth of hundreds of bodies working in close quarters, created an atmosphere that turned breathing into labor. Sweat dripped constantly, creating slick surfaces that made every movement treacherous. Your clothes became heavy with moisture, adding weight to a body that was already carrying more than it could bear. The cotton fibers in the air stuck to your damp skin, creating a second skin of industrial waste that itched and irritated but could not be removed during working hours. Time moved differently in the factory. Minutes stretched like hours when you were waiting for the next break that wouldn't come. Hours compressed into moments when you realized how much work still needed to be completed before the day ended. The factory had no clocks visible to workers, only the bells and whistles that mark the transition from one form of misery to another. You measured time not in minutes, but in pieces completed, threads spun, bobbins filled. The evening shift brought different challenges as fatigue accumulated and concentration wavered. This was when accidents happened most frequently, when tired hands slipped and found moving machinery, when exhausted workers stumbled into hazards they would have easily avoided earlier in the day. The overseers knew this and watched more carefully as the day progressed, not out of concern for worker safety, but because accidents could damage expensive equipment. Your body developed its own rhythm, different from the natural cycles that had governed human activity for millennia. Sleep came not because darkness fell, but because the factory whistle declared the day's work finished. Hunger arrived not at meal times, but whenever your body had burned through its meager fuel reserves. Thirst was constant, a parched throat companion that reminded you that the water available at work was often contaminated with industrial runoff and sometimes carried diseases that could kill you faster than the machinery. The social dynamics of the factory floor were shaped by exhaustion and competition. Workers were paid by the piece, creating a system where helping a colleague meant reducing your own earnings. Conversations were impossible over the noise of machinery, so isolation became the default state, even when surrounded by hundreds of other people. The shared experience of suffering created bonds between workers, but these relationships had to be maintained through glances and gestures rather than words. Your hands developed a life of their own, moving through familiar motions even when your mind drifted toward thoughts of escape or rest. Muscle memory took over when consciousness failed, allowing your body to continue working even when your brain had essentially shut down from exhaustion. This automation was necessary for survival, but it came at the cost of mental engagement with the world around you. The end of the workday brought no celebration, only the grim satisfaction of having survived another 16 hours without serious injury. The walk home was a zombie shuffle through streets filled with other industrial casualties, people whose bodies had been pushed beyond reasonable limits and who moved with the careful gait of the permanently damaged. Sleep, when it finally came, was not rest, but unconsciousness, a temporary escape from a body that hurt in places you hadn't known could hurt. Night brought dreams of machinery, endless repetitions of the day's work that followed you into sleep and denied you even the escape of unconsciousness. You dreamed of looms and spinning wheels, of belts and gears, of the overseer's voice calling for faster production. Rest became another form of labor, your mind processing the day's mechanical rhythms and preparing for tomorrow's identical performance. This was the killing schedule that defined your existence, a daily routine that ground down human bodies and spirits with mechanical precision. The factory owners had calculated exactly how much work a human body could perform before it broke down completely, and they scheduled the workday to extract every possible hour of labor without quite killing their workers outright. It was a system designed to consume human life at the maximum sustainable rate, turning people into mechanical components that could be operated until failure and then replaced with fresh parts from the endless supply of desperate workers waiting outside the factory gates. Chapter 5. Masters of Misery. The man who owned your life had never set foot on the factory floor. He lived in a mansion 20 miles away, surrounded by gardens tended by servants who earned more in a month than you made in a year. To him, you were a number in a ledger book, a unit of production whose value was measured entirely by the amount of profit your labor could generate. Your pain, your exhaustion, your slow poisoning by industrial chemicals, these were simply the cost of doing business. His representative on the factory floor was the overseer, a man whose soul had been eaten away by years of grinding down human spirits for modest wages. He moved through the rows of workers like a predator, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of weakness, fatigue, or defiance. His voice carried over the mechanical din through years of practice, barking orders and corrections that cut through the noise like a whip through flesh. The overseer's job was simple in concept, but brutal in execution. He had to extract the maximum amount of work from human beings who were already operating beyond their natural limits. His tools were fear, humiliation, and the constant threat of unemployment that hung over every worker like a sword suspended by spider silk. He knew that behind every employed worker stood a dozen desperate souls willing to take their place for even less pay. Your workday began with his inspection, a ritual humiliation where he examined your hands for signs of injury that might slow production. Check your clothing for tears that might indicate poverty extreme enough to affect your work performance, and studied your face for any expression that suggested less than complete dedication to the factory's needs. Workers who showed signs of illness were sent home without pay, while those who appeared too healthy were suspected of not working hard enough. The fining system was his favorite weapon, a bureaucracy of punishment that could steal your wages for infractions both real and imaginary. Arriving 3 minutes late cost you an hour's pay. Speaking during work hours resulted in a half-day's wages being deducted. Breaking a tool, even through normal wear and use, meant losing a week's earnings to cover replacement costs. The rules changed without notice, creating a maze of regulations designed to ensure that workers never received their full wages. He distributed work assignments with the calculated cruelty of someone who understood that hope and despair could be measured in pennies. The workers he favored received slightly easier tasks or marginally better equipment, creating a hierarchy of suffering that prevented solidarity among the laborers. Those who displeased him found themselves assigned to the most dangerous machines, the hottest areas of the factory, the tasks that carried the highest risk of injury or death. The overseer's power extended beyond the factory walls through a network of informants and spies who reported on workers' activities during their brief hours away from the machinery. Speaking about working conditions to outsiders, attempting to organize meetings with other workers, or even expressing dissatisfaction within earshot of the wrong person could result in immediate dismissal and blacklisting from other factories in the area. His office was a wooden box suspended above the factory floor, positioned to provide a commanding view of every workstation. From this perch, he watched through windows that allowed him to see everything while remaining insulated from the noise, heat, and poisonous air that defined your working environment. The office represented everything workers would never have: space, quiet, clean air, and the power to control other human beings. The punishment rituals were designed not just to correct behavior, but to terrorize the entire workforce. Workers who broke rules were forced to stand in front of their colleagues, while the overseer detailed their failures and announced their penalties. These public humiliations served as theater, performances designed to remind everyone that any moment of weakness or defiance would be met with swift and merciless retribution. He kept detailed records of every worker's performance, creating files that followed people from job to job like invisible chains. These records included not just productivity measurements, but personal information, family situations, debts, health problems, anything that could be used as leverage to ensure compliance. Workers with sick children or elderly parents were particularly vulnerable, their desperation making them ideal candidates for the most exploitative assignments. The overseer's own position was precarious, dependent on maintaining production quotas while keeping labor costs as low as possible. This pressure transformed him into a machine for extracting human suffering, someone who had learned to see workers not as people, but as mechanical components that needed to be operated at maximum efficiency until they broke down and required replacement. His relationship with the factory owner was built on shared numbers: tons of cotton processed, yards of cloth produced, profits generated per worker per day. Human costs were externalized, treated as someone else's problem. The deaths, injuries, and destroyed lives that resulted from his management style never appeared in the reports he sent to his employer, making it easy for both men to sleep peacefully while their workers suffered. This was the face of industrial capitalism, a system that concentrated wealth by grinding up human lives and converting suffering into profit. The overseer and his distant employer represented a new kind of aristocracy, one based not on noble birth but on the ability to extract value from other people's labor while insulating themselves from the consequences of their actions. Chapter 6. Poison in the Air. Each breath you drew was a small suicide, a conscious decision to fill your lungs with air that carried death in microscopic particles. The atmosphere inside the factory was not air at all, but a toxic soup of cotton fibers, chemical vapors, metal dust, and coal smoke that transformed the simple act of breathing into a slow-motion execution. The cotton mills were the worst, filled with floating clouds of fiber, so thick they created their own weather systems inside the buildings. These particles, invisible individually, but collectively dense enough to obscure vision, invaded every part of your respiratory system. They settled in your nose, irritated your throat, and embedded themselves deep in your lungs where they would remain for the rest of your shortened life. Your morning cough became a ritual, a violent expulsion of the previous day's accumulated poison that stained your handkerchief with blood and fiber. The sound echoed through the tenements each dawn as hundreds of workers performed the same desperate attempt to clear their airways before subjecting them to another day's assault. The cough grew deeper and more persistent with each passing month, evolving from an inconvenience into a constant reminder of your slow assassination by atmosphere. Chemical factories added their own special flavors to the poisonous air. Sulfur compounds that burned your eyes and throat, chlorine gas that turned your breath into razor blades, heavy metals that accumulated in your organs and gradually destroyed your nervous system. Workers in these facilities developed distinctive symptoms: tremors from mercury exposure, anemia from lead poisoning, skin conditions from contact with acids and alkalis. The dye works created rainbow clouds of toxicity, brilliant colors that marked workers as surely as brands mark cattle. Your skin took on the hue of whatever chemical you worked with most closely, turning blue from indigo exposure, yellow from chromium compounds, or a sickly green from copper solutions. These stains penetrated so deeply that they became permanent markers of your occupation, visible proof of the poison coursing through your system. Coal smoke from the factory steam engines mixed with the industrial chemicals to create new compounds that had never existed in nature. These hybrid toxins were often more dangerous than their individual components, creating health effects that doctors couldn't understand because they had never seen them before. You became test subjects in an uncontrolled experiment in human poisoning, your bodies providing data on the long-term effects of industrial exposure. Metalworking facilities filled the air with particles of iron, steel, brass, and lead. These microscopic shards acted like sandpaper in your lungs, creating scar tissue that reduced your breathing capacity with each passing day. The metal dust also carried with it traces of the oils and acids used in manufacturing processes, creating a cocktail of toxins that attacked your respiratory system from multiple directions simultaneously. The ventilation systems, when they existed at all, were designed to protect the machinery rather than the workers. Fresh air was directed towards sensitive equipment, while stale, poison-laden atmosphere was left to circulate through the areas where humans labored. This created dead zones where the air became so toxic that even experienced workers could only remain for short periods before their bodies began to shut down. Your sense of smell became both hypersensitive and completely useless. You could detect the slightest change in the chemical composition of the air around you, an early warning system that might provide a few seconds' notice before a particularly dangerous release of toxins. At the same time, The constant exposure to industrial chemicals gradually destroyed your ability to smell anything normal, leaving you isolated in a world where the sense of flowers, food, and clean air became foreign experiences. The seasonal variations in air quality created different forms of torture throughout the year. Summer brought stagnant air that trapped industrial vapors close to the ground, creating concentrations of toxins that could kill workers within hours. Winter meant closed windows and reduced ventilation, allowing chemical buildups that transformed factory floors into gas chambers where workers struggled to remain conscious. Night shifts faced additional hazards as the reduced staffing meant less attention to ventilation systems and chemical safety protocols. The darkness concealed dangerous leaks and spills, forcing workers to navigate by smell and sound through atmospheres that could blind, burn, or suffocate them. Many workers reported hallucinations during night shifts, though whether these were caused by chemical exposure or sleep deprivation was impossible to determine. Your children inherited your poison breath. Mothers working in factories during pregnancy passed industrial toxins directly to their unborn babies, creating a generation born already damaged by chemicals they had never directly encountered. Nursing mothers continued this toxic inheritance, their milk carrying the accumulated poisons of their working lives directly to their infants. The long-term effects accumulated like compound interest, building slowly and invisibly until sudden collapse revealed the true cost of industrial employment. Workers in their 30s developed the lung capacity of elderly men, their breathing reduced to shallow gasps that provided barely enough oxygen to sustain life. Many died, not from dramatic accidents, but from the slow suffocation of lungs that had finally surrendered to years of chemical assault. This was the air you bought with your labor, an atmosphere so poisoned that breathing itself became an act of slow suicide. The factory owners knew the dangers, but calculated that replacing poisoned workers was cheaper than installing proper ventilation systems. Your lungs were considered disposable equipment, biological filters that could be used until they failed, and then replaced with fresh ones from the endless supply of desperate workers waiting outside the factory gates. Chapter 7. Broken Bodies. Your skeleton was being rewritten by industry, reshaped by forces that human bones were never designed to withstand. The repetitive motions required by factory work gradually twisted your spine, curved your shoulders, and locked your joints into positions that served the machinery's needs rather than your body's natural alignment. You were being transformed into a human machine, optimized for industrial efficiency at the cost of everything that made movement graceful, comfortable, or natural. The endless standing warped your legs and feet into instruments of endurance rather than mobility. Your arches collapsed under the constant pressure, creating flat feet that couldn't properly absorb the shock of walking on hard factory floors. Varicose veins bulged beneath your skin like purple ropes, carrying blood that struggled to flow upward against gravity through legs that never had the chance to elevate and rest. Your ankles swelled each day until your shoes became torture devices that compressed flesh already pushed beyond its limits. Your hands were perhaps the most visible casualties of industrial labor. The repetitive gripping and twisting motions required to operate machinery gradually froze your fingers into claws that could perform factory tasks, but struggled with the simple activities of daily life. Writing became impossible as your fingers lost the fine motor control needed to guide a pen. Buttoning clothes, tying shoes, even holding a cup of water became challenges that required conscious effort and caused shooting pains through joints that had been worn smooth by repetitive motion. The machinery's vibrations traveled through your body like earthquakes, shaking your internal organs and disrupting the delicate systems that kept you alive. Workers who operated particularly violent machines developed a condition known as dead finger, with a constant vibration damaged nerves and blood vessels so severely that fingertips lost all sensation and sometimes turned black from lack of circulation. These digits would eventually fall off, leaving workers with hands that looked like they had been gnawed by some mechanical predator. Your spine curved into the question mark shape that marked factory workers as distinctly as uniforms. The constant bending over machinery, combined with the twisting motions required to reach into mechanical spaces, gradually compressed your vertebrae and pulled your shoulders forward into a permanent hunch. This deformation wasn't just cosmetic. It compressed your internal organs, reduced your lung capacity, and created chronic pain that never left you completely even during your brief hours of rest. Heat exposure from industrial processes caused your body to develop its own survival mechanisms that came at terrible costs. Your skin thickened and leathered, losing its sensitivity to temperature changes that might warn you away from dangerous heat sources. Sweat glands worked overtime and then burned out, leaving you unable to regulate your body temperature properly. Many workers developed heat stroke repeatedly, their bodies' cooling systems damaged beyond repair by exposure to industrial furnaces. The lifting and carrying required by factory work destroyed your back through 1,000 small injuries that accumulated into permanent disability. Hernias became so common among industrial workers that they were considered an occupational hazard rather than a medical emergency. Your abdominal muscles, strained beyond their capacity by lifting loads that required team effort, would eventually tear and allow your internal organs to push through the muscle wall, creating bulges that mark you as clearly as any factory badge. Respiratory damage from industrial air created a cascade of physical problems that extended far beyond your lungs. The reduced oxygen in your blood meant that your heart had to work harder to supply your body's needs, leading to enlarged heart muscles and irregular rhythms that could kill you without warning. Your brain, starved of proper oxygenation, functioned at a reduced capacity that affected everything from memory to emotional regulation. Chemical exposure attacked your nervous system with surgical precision, targeting different functions depending on which toxins you encountered most frequently. Lead poisoning caused tremors and cognitive decline that made workers appear drunk or mentally deficient. Mercury exposure created mood swings and personality changes that destroyed relationships and families. Benzene compounds attacked your bone marrow, reducing your body's ability to produce healthy blood cells and leaving you vulnerable to infections and bleeding disorders. Your reproductive system bore the hidden costs of industrial employment. Men exposed to factory chemicals often became sterile or fathered children with birth defects that revealed the genetic damage caused by toxic exposure. Women faced additional challenges as industrial chemicals disrupted their menstrual cycles, caused miscarriages, or produced children born already poisoned by their mother's working conditions. Sleep provided no relief from the physical damage being done to your body. Your muscles, locked into unnatural positions for 16 hours each day, would cramp and spasm during the night, preventing the rest that might have allowed some healing. Your joints, inflamed from repetitive stress, ached continuously and made finding a comfortable sleeping position impossible. Even unconsciousness couldn't protect you from the pain that had become your constant companion. Malnutrition accelerated every form of physical damage your body sustained. Without adequate protein, your muscles couldn't repair themselves after each day's destruction. Lack of vitamins meant that small cuts refused to heal and minor injuries became infected wounds that could turn fatal. Your bones, deprived of proper nutrition, became brittle and prone to fractures from impacts that a healthy person might barely notice. This physical destruction was the price of industrial progress, paid not by the factory owners who profited from your labor, but by your body, which bore the cost of mechanization. You were being consumed by the machinery as surely as coal was consumed by the steam engines, transformed from a healthy human being into a broken remnant whose only remaining value lay in the few productive years left before complete physical collapse, made you unemployable and disposable. Chapter 8. Starvation Wages. The coins they placed in your palm each week carried the weight of cruelty disguised as compensation. Your wages, calculated to the penny, represented not fair payment for your labor, but the minimum amount required to keep you alive and working until your body could no longer serve the machinery's needs. Every copper piece was a careful measurement of human desperation, a precise calculation of how little money could sustain life while ensuring you remained trapped in the industrial system. The factory owners had perfected the mathematics of exploitation, determining exactly how much food, shelter, and clothing a worker needed to remain functional while ensuring that any small pleasure or comfort remained forever beyond reach. Your wages bought survival, nothing more. The difference between what your labor produced and what you received in payment flowed directly into the pockets of men who never set foot on the factory floor. The truck system transformed even your meager wages into another form of bondage. Instead of receiving money, you were often paid in tokens or script that could only be spent at company-owned stores. These establishments charged prices far above market rates for goods of inferior quality, ensuring that your wages bought even less than their small amount suggested. A loaf of bread that cost 3 pence in town shops cost 6 pence at the company store, effectively cutting your real wages in half. Your grocery purchases were exercises in desperate mathematics. A pound of flour, a bit of bacon fat, some potatoes, these constituted luxury shopping for a factory worker's family. Meat was a memory from childhood, when your father might have caught a rabbit or your mother might have traded eggs for a small piece of pork. Vegetables meant whatever grew wild near the factory or could be salvaged from the refuse piles behind better neighborhoods. The rent for your single room consumed half your wages before you had spent a penny on food or clothing. Landlords knew exactly how much factory workers earned and set their prices accordingly, creating a system where housing costs left just enough money to prevent starvation while ensuring that saving for better accommodations remained impossible. You were trapped in the same squalid room year after year, watching your wages disappear into the pockets of men who owned the land beneath your suffering. Clothing became a treasure more precious than gold. Your clothes, purchased when you first found employment, had to last until they literally fell apart, patched and repatched until they resembled fabric quilts held together by thread and determination. New clothing was an investment that required months of planning and saving, during which time you might go without other necessities to accumulate the pennies needed for a replacement shirt or pair of shoes. Your children learned arithmetic through the cruel lessons of poverty economics. They could calculate exactly how many hours of factory work bought a loaf of bread, how many days of wages paid for a week's rent, how many months of saving might accumulate enough money for a winter coat. These calculations became more important than any formal education, teaching survival skills that no school could provide. Medical care existed only in theory for someone earning factory wages. Doctors charged fees that represented weeks of work, making professional medical attention a luxury reserved for the wealthy. When illness struck, you treated yourself with folk remedies and desperate hope, often continuing to work while sick because missing wages could mean the difference between eating and starving for your entire family. The cycle of debt ensured that even small emergencies could trap you permanently in financial bondage. A sick child requiring medicine, a work injury that prevented earning for a few days, a winter cold that lingered too long. Any of these could force you to borrow money at interest rates that made repayment nearly impossible. The company often served as lender, creating debts that tied you to your job more effectively than any chain. Your entertainment budget consisted of whatever cost nothing. Walking through parts of town where you might glimpse how others lived, sitting by the river on the rare occasions when work ended before complete darkness, sharing stories with neighbors who faced the same grinding poverty. The taverns where workers might once have found companionship charged prices that made even a single pint of beer a significant expense. Economic mobility was a myth designed to make poverty seem temporary rather than systematic. The wages paid to factory workers were specifically calculated to prevent accumulation of capital that might allow escape from industrial employment. You could work for decades without saving enough money to buy tools, rent shop space, or invest in any enterprise that might provide independence from factory labor. The seasonal nature of some industrial work created additional financial tortures. Mills that closed during slow periods left workers without income for months at a time, forcing families to survive on whatever small amounts they might have saved during working periods. These savings, never adequate to begin with, disappeared quickly, leaving workers deeper in debt when employment resumed. Your relationship with money became defined by scarcity and fear. Every expenditure required careful consideration. Every purchase weighed against other desperate needs. The luxury of spending money without calculating its impact on survival was as foreign to your experience as the luxury of leisure or comfort. Money represented not freedom, but a constant reminder of how little freedom you possessed. This economic system was designed not to reward labor, but to exploit it, creating a class of workers who remained permanently dependent on industrial employment while generating wealth for others. Your poverty was not an accident or a failure of character, but a carefully maintained condition that served the interests of those who profited from your desperation. The wages you received were not payment, but bait, just enough to keep you trapped in a system that consumed your life while enriching others. Chapter 9. The Slums. Your home was not a sanctuary, but another form of prison, a cramped cell in a vast maze of human misery that stretched for miles around every industrial center. The slums rose like festering wounds beside the factories. Housing developments designed not for human habitation, but for the efficient storage of workers between shifts. These neighborhoods were monuments to the philosophy that human beings could be warehoused as cheaply as any other industrial commodity. The back-to-back houses stood in rows like gravestones, each sharing walls with its neighbors on three sides and opening on a narrow courtyards that never saw sunlight. Your family occupied a single room in one of these structures, a space perhaps 10 feet square that served as bedroom, kitchen, dining room, and workshop for whatever piecework might supplement your factory wages. Privacy was a luxury that required space, and space was something working families could never afford. 12 people might share a cellar dwelling, sleeping in shifts because there wasn't room for everyone to lie down simultaneously. The lucky ones slept on straw mattresses that had been used by so many previous occupants that they had become ecosystems unto themselves, home to insects, rodents, and diseases that thrived in the warm, moist environment created by too many bodies pressed together in too small a space. Water came from a single pump that served dozens of families, if it came at all. During dry periods, the pump might run for only a few hours each day, forcing residents to queue with buckets and pots to collect whatever they could before the flow stopped. This water, drawn from wells that had been contaminated by industrial runoff and human waste, carried diseases that spread through the slums like wildfire through dry grass. The sewage system consisted of open drains that ran between the houses, carrying human waste, industrial chemicals, and dead animals toward the river that supplied water to other parts of the city. These channels became breeding grounds for cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, diseases that killed with such regularity that neighborhoods developed their own rhythms around epidemic cycles. Your neighbors were fellow casualties of the industrial system, families broken by factory work and poverty into collections of individuals struggling to survive rather than communities capable of mutual support. The woman next door might work night shifts at the textile mill while her husband labored days at the foundry, leaving their children to fend for themselves in streets that offered no safety and no supervision. The air in the slums carried the same industrial poisons that filled the factories, plus the additional toxins generated by thousands of people living without proper sanitation or waste disposal. Coal smoke from heating fires mixed with the stench of human waste and rotting garbage to create an atmosphere that assaulted every sense. Children born in these neighborhoods often developed respiratory problems before they learned to walk. Rent consumed half your wages for the privilege of living in conditions that would have been condemned as unfit for animals in better neighborhoods. Landlords, many of them factory owners who profited from workers' labor during the day and their desperation for shelter at night, charged whatever they pleased because they knew their tenants had no alternatives. Falling behind on rent meant eviction into homelessness that was often a death sentence. The buildings themselves were constructed with the same disregard for human welfare that characterized the factories. Walls were thin enough that every sound traveled between rooms, making privacy impossible and sleep difficult. Roofs leaked during rain, creating damp conditions that promoted mold and disease. Foundations were often built on industrial waste, creating structures that poisoned their inhabitants from the ground up. Windows, when they existed, were small and often covered with cloth or paper rather than glass, creating perpetual twilight inside rooms that needed whatever natural light they could capture. Artificial lighting came from candles or oil lamps that added fire danger to the list of daily hazards residents faced. Many families simply lived in darkness after sunset, going to bed when the sun went down to save the cost of fuel. Food storage was impossible in homes without proper ventilation or refrigeration. Bread molded within days, milk soured quickly, and meat became dangerous to eat almost immediately after purchase. Families learned to buy only what they could consume the same day, limiting their diets to foods that could survive the hostile environment of slum housing. Children played in streets that served as open sewers, their games interrupted by the passage of carts carrying industrial waste or human waste to dumping grounds outside the city. These same streets flooded during heavy rains, turning neighborhoods into swamps of contaminated water that carried disease directly into homes and contaminated whatever food families had managed to store. Violence was as common as hunger in neighborhoods where desperation and proximity created constant friction. Fights broke out over access to water, disputes about noise, competition for the few jobs available to slum residents. The police rarely entered these areas except to collect bodies or suppress riots, leaving residents to establish their own systems of justice and order. The cycle of poverty was built into the physical structure of the slums themselves. Children who grew up in these conditions started life with health problems, educational disadvantages, and social stigmas that made escape nearly impossible. They became the next generation of factory workers, trapped by circumstances that had been engineered to ensure a constant supply of desperate labor. Seasonal changes brought different forms of misery to slum dwellers. Winter meant choosing between fuel for heating and money for food, as families burned whatever they could find to stay warm in buildings that offered no insulation from the cold. Summer brought infestations of insects and the stench of waste that accumulated faster than it could be removed. This was home for the industrial working class, a place that existed not to shelter human beings, but to store them as efficiently as possible between their productive hours. The slums were as much a part of the industrial system as the factories themselves, designed to keep workers alive while ensuring they remained desperate enough to accept whatever conditions their employers chose to impose. Chapter 10: Disease and Death. Death stalked through your world with the casual confidence of a landlord collecting rent, claiming victims with such regularity that grief became a permanent resident in every household. In the industrial slums, mortality was not an eventual destination, but a daily companion, present in every breath of poisoned air, every sip of contaminated water, every hour spent breathing the toxic atmosphere of factory floors. Cholera arrived like a conquering army, sweeping through neighborhoods and leaving behind empty houses and broken families. The disease spread through water supplies contaminated by human waste and industrial chemicals, killing with a speed that made burial impossible to keep up with. Entire families would sicken and die within days, their bodies piling up in homes where no one remained alive to carry them away. Tuberculosis was the slow killer, the wasting disease that consumed workers from within over months or years. The combination of poor nutrition, overcrowded living conditions, and lungs already damaged by industrial chemicals created perfect conditions for the disease to flourish. You could hear it moving through the tenements at night, the distinctive cough that marked another family's descent into slow-motion tragedy. Factory work created its own catalog of diseases that doctors struggled to understand and had no hope of treating. Phossy jaw attacked workers in match factories, where exposure to phosphorus caused their jawbones to literally glow in the dark before rotting away. Lead poisoning from paint and plumbing created tremors, madness, and death among workers who had no understanding of the toxins they handled daily. Industrial accidents provided quicker, but no less certain paths to death. Unguarded machinery claimed limbs, crushed bodies, and scalped workers with mechanical precision. Factory fires, fed by cotton fibers and oil-soaked wood, could consume entire buildings in minutes, often with workers trapped inside by locked doors designed to prevent theft. Explosions from steam boilers operating beyond their safety limits turned workers into fragments scattered across factory floors. Children died with such frequency that parents learned not to name them until they survived their first year, and often not until they reached age 5. Infant mortality rates in industrial districts approached 50%, meaning that half of all babies born would never see their first birthday. Those who survived childhood often bore permanent damage from malnutrition, disease, or industrial exposure that marked them for shortened lives. Medical care existed in theory, but not in practice for working families. Doctors charged fees that represented weeks of wages, making professional medical attention available only to those wealthy enough to avoid the conditions that created most illnesses. When workers did seek medical help, they often encountered treatments that were more dangerous than the diseases they were meant to cure. The medical understanding of the time made treatment a form of torture that rarely helped and often hastened death. Bloodletting was prescribed for conditions caused by blood loss from injuries. Mercury, a poison that created more problems than it solved, was used to treat everything from headaches to heart conditions. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or antiseptics, creating more deaths than it prevented. Hospitals were places where poor people went to die rather than get well. These institutions, overcrowded and understaffed, became breeding grounds for diseases that spread rapidly among patients who were already weakened by industrial employment. Hospital mortality rates were so high that admission was often equivalent to a death sentence, leading many workers to prefer dying at home to seeking institutional care. Workplace injuries were treated as minor inconveniences rather than medical emergencies. Workers who lost fingers to machinery were expected to return to work the same day, their wounds wrapped in whatever cloth was available and their reduced capacity simply accepted as part of the job. Broken bones were set by whoever happened to be nearby, often healing crookedly and leaving workers permanently disabled. The poisoning was gradual but relentless, as workers absorbed industrial chemicals through their skin, breathed metal particles into their lungs, and consumed food contaminated by factory runoff. Lead, mercury, arsenic, and dozens of other toxins accumulated in workers' bodies over years, creating symptoms that doctors couldn't diagnose because they had never seen such systematic poisoning before. Malnutrition weakened every body system, making workers vulnerable to diseases that well-fed people might easily resist. Scurvy, rickets, and pellagra, diseases of vitamin deficiency, were common among workers whose diets consisted primarily of bread and potatoes. These conditions caused teeth to fall out, bones to bend and break, and skin to break down, creating additional sources of infection and pain. Mental illness was both cause and effect of industrial employment. The stress of constant danger, the despair of poverty, and the isolation of factory work created depression and anxiety that often led to suicide. Workers also suffered brain damage from chemical exposure and head injuries from industrial accidents, creating behavioral changes that were misunderstood and mistreated by society that had no concept of occupational mental health. Pregnancy became a form of occupational hazard for women factory workers, who continued laboring with dangerous chemicals and heavy machinery until the moment of birth. Many babies were born already poisoned by their mother's workplace exposures, while others died during childbirth because their mothers' bodies had been too damaged by industrial work to safely deliver children. The cycle of sickness and death created a climate of fatalism among workers, who learned to accept that their lives would be short and painful. This acceptance became another form of control, preventing workers from demanding better conditions because they had been conditioned to believe that suffering was their natural fate rather than the result of deliberate choices made by those who profited from their labor. Chapteronce no escape. The system that trapped you was not built from iron bars or locked doors, but from a web of economic, legal, and social constraints that made leaving factory work nearly impossible despite its deadly conditions. Every attempt at escape was met with barriers designed to force you back into industrial employment, creating a form of slavery that was legal, profitable, and devastatingly effective. Debt became your first chain, forged link by link through the company's store system that ensured you always owed more than you earned. The factory owners calculated these debts precisely, maintaining balances that were large enough to prevent departure but small enough to avoid complete despair. Every purchase of food, clothing, or shelter added to obligations that could never be fully repaid, creating a financial bondage that passed from parents to children like inherited disease. The truck system extended this control by paying wages in company script that could only be spent at company stores. This created a closed economic loop where your labor generated profits that immediately flowed back to your employers through inflated prices for necessities. Even if you managed to save money, it existed only as credit with the company that employed you, worthless anywhere else and useless for achieving independence. Company housing served as another form of imprisonment, tying your shelter directly to your employment. Lose your job, lose your home immediately. This arrangement gave employers absolute power over workers' lives, knowing that any act of defiance could result in instant homelessness for entire families. The housing itself was often built on company land using company materials, creating structures that existed solely to warehouse workers between shifts. Legal barriers reinforced economic ones through laws designed to criminalize worker mobility and organization. Vagrancy statutes made unemployment itself illegal, ensuring that anyone who left factory work without immediately finding other employment could be arrested and forced into labor as punishment. Contract laws bound workers to specific employers for extended periods, making job changes legally impossible even when working conditions became unbearable. The blacklisting system created invisible walls around entire industries, as employers shared information about workers who had caused trouble, demanded better conditions, or attempted to organize their colleagues. Once blacklisted, a worker could find employment nowhere in their region, forcing families to choose between starvation and submission. This system was particularly effective because it operated in secret, leaving workers unaware that they had been marked until they found themselves unemployable. Geographic isolation trapped workers in factory towns where industrial employment was the only option for survival. These communities were deliberately built in locations far from alternative economic opportunities, creating captive populations that had no choice but to accept whatever conditions local factory owners chose to impose. The company often owned not just the factories but the entire town, controlling housing, food supplies, and even access to transportation. Educational barriers prevented workers' children from acquiring skills that might allow escape from industrial employment. Company schools, when they existed, focused on training future factory workers rather than providing general education that might create other opportunities. Most working children received no formal education at all, spending their days in factories learning only the specific skills needed for industrial labor. Social isolation reinforced economic imprisonment by cutting working families off from networks that might provide alternative opportunities or support during times of crisis. The demands of factory work left no time for maintaining relationships outside the industrial community, while the stigma attached to factory employment made workers unwanted in other social circles. This isolation prevented the formation of support systems that might have helped individuals escape industrial employment. The savings required for economic independence remained forever beyond reach for workers whose wages were calculated to provide only survival-level income. Starting a small business, buying tools for independent work, or accumulating enough money to survive while seeking other employment required capital that factory wages could never provide. The mathematical precision of this poverty was deliberate, designed to ensure a permanent supply of desperate workers. Transportation limitations trapped workers in specific locations by making travel expensive and difficult. Most workers could not afford horses, carriages, or even regular coach fares to other towns where employment opportunities might exist. The factory owners often controlled local transportation as well, limiting access to roads, rivers, and railway connections that might have allowed workers to seek opportunities elsewhere. Information control prevented workers from learning about conditions in other locations or industries that might offer better opportunities. Company-controlled newspapers reported only information that served employers' interests, while workers had no access to independent sources of information about employment opportunities, working conditions, or legal rights. This ignorance kept workers trapped in situations they might have escaped if they had known alternatives existed. Family obligations created additional chains that bound workers to industrial employment, even when they personally might have been willing to risk escape. Parents could not abandon children to pursue uncertain opportunities elsewhere, while workers often supported elderly relatives who could not survive without their wages. The factory owners understood these emotional bonds and used them as leverage to ensure worker compliance. Legal protections that might have provided avenues for escape simply did not exist for working people. Labor laws, workplace safety regulations, and minimum wage protections were absent from the legal system, leaving workers with no recourse when employers violated even basic human decency. The courts, controlled by the same interests that owned the factories, consistently ruled against workers in any disputes over wages, working conditions, or employment contracts. This system of control was totalitarian in its effectiveness, creating conditions where escape from industrial employment required not just individual courage, but extraordinary luck and resources that were systematically denied to working families. The trap was so complete that most workers eventually stopped looking for ways out, accepting their situation as permanent and focusing their limited energy on survival rather than escape. Chapter 12: Broken Families. The factory system shattered families with the mechanical precision of the machinery that defined your working life, grinding human relationships into fragments that could never be reassembled into their original form. Industrial employment did not simply exploit individual workers. It attacked the fundamental bonds between parents and children, husbands and wives, creating social wreckage that extended far beyond the factory walls. Children disappeared into the machinery before they had learned to read, their small bodies swallowed by industrial demands that recognized no distinction between adult workers and developing human beings. You watch your own children age not in years, but in injuries, their bright eyes growing dull with exhaustion, and their small hands developing the calluses and scars that mark them as property of the industrial system. The laughter that should have filled your home was replaced by the silence of exhaustion and the quiet whimpering of bodies pushed beyond their capacity to endure. Work schedules designed around machinery rather than human needs made family life impossible to maintain. When fathers worked day shifts and mothers worked nights, families became collections of strangers who shared living space but never shared time together. Children might go weeks without seeing both parents awake simultaneously, their development shaped not by family guidance, but by the random influences of streets and neighbors who were struggling with their own survival. The economic pressures of industrial employment forced families to treat each other as economic units rather than emotional connections. Children were valued not for their potential or their joy, but for their earning capacity, measured by how quickly they could be transformed into productive workers. Parents learned to see their offspring through the cold mathematics of survival, calculating which children might live long enough to contribute wages and which might be too weak to justify the food they consumed. Physical exhaustion destroyed the emotional energy needed to maintain family relationships. Parents who spent 16 hours each day in dangerous, demanding factory work had nothing left to give when they returned to homes that offered no comfort or peace. The tenderness and patience required for raising children became luxuries that working families could not afford, replaced by the harsh efficiency of survival-focused interactions. Industrial poisons affected not just individual workers, but entire family lines, as parents passed chemical damage to their children through exposure during pregnancy and nursing. Babies were born already marked by their parents' working conditions, their development stunted by toxins they had never directly encountered. These children carried industrial damage in their bones and blood, creating generations of workers who were physically damaged before they began their own factory employment. The company housing system deliberately undermined family privacy and autonomy by forcing multiple families to share spaces designed for individual households. Parents could not protect their children from the influences of neighbors whose desperation might drive them to crime, prostitution, or other activities that thrived in communities where normal social structures had collapsed under economic pressure. Marriages became economic partnerships rather than emotional bonds, as couples united primarily by their shared need for survival rather than love or compatibility. The romantic courtship that characterized relationships in other social classes was impossible for workers whose every waking hour was consumed by labor. Couples met, married, and began producing children with the efficiency of industrial processes, their relationships shaped by necessity rather than choice. The constant threat of death from industrial accidents, workplace diseases, or simply the grinding effects of poverty meant that family relationships existed under the shadow of impermanent loss. Children learned not to become too attached to parents who might die from factor-related causes, while parents steeled themselves against the grief of losing children to industrial employment or the diseases that thrived in working-class neighborhoods. Educational opportunities that might have created different futures for workers' children were sacrificed to immediate economic needs. Families that might have valued learning and development were forced to send children into factories as soon as they could perform useful work, cutting short any possibility of intellectual or artistic development that might have broken the cycle of industrial employment. The social stigma attached to factory work isolated working families from communities and relationships that might have provided emotional support during times of crisis. Workers were marked by their employment as clearly as if they wore uniforms, creating class divisions that prevented the formation of cross-class relationships that might have offered alternative models for family life or social organization. Religious and cultural traditions that had previously provided structure and meaning to family life were abandoned under the pressure of industrial employment. Families had no time for church attendance, holiday celebrations, or the ceremonies that marked important life transitions. These losses left working families adrift without the cultural anchors that had previously given meaning to suffering and structure to relationships. Generational knowledge that had been passed from parents to children for centuries was lost as industrial employment required completely different skills from those that had sustained previous generations. Parents could not prepare their children for adult life because the world they were entering bore no resemblance to anything that had existed before. This loss of continuity created families where parents and children lived in different worlds despite sharing the same physical space. The violence that pervaded industrial communities infected family relationships as well, as the stress and desperation of factory life created domestic situations where physical and emotional abuse became normalized responses to unbearable pressure. Children learned violence from parents who had no other way to express their frustration with conditions they could not change or escape. This destruction of family life was not an accidental byproduct of industrial development, but a necessary component of a system that required workers to be available for whatever demands employers chose to make. Strong family bonds might have provided workers with emotional resources that could have sustained resistance to industrial exploitation, so those bonds had to be systematically destroyed to maintain the level of desperation that kept workers compliant and productive. Chapter 13. The Few Who Fought Back. In the depths of industrial darkness, a few brave souls refused to accept that suffering was their permanent fate. These workers, knowing that organizing meant risking everything they had, began to whisper in shadows about something that factory owners feared more than fire or flood: the possibility that workers might unite and demand to be treated as human beings rather than mechanical components. The earliest meetings took place in cellars, abandoned buildings, and remote fields where industrial spies could not easily penetrate. Workers gathered by candlelight, speaking in hushed voices about wages, working conditions, and the radical idea that people who created wealth deserved to share in its benefits. These assemblies were acts of extraordinary courage, as discovery meant instant dismissal, blacklisting, and often violent retribution from employers who saw worker organization as a direct threat to their profits. Your first union meeting felt like joining a conspiracy against the natural order of the world. The men and women who attended bore the same marks of industrial employment that scarred your own body: missing fingers, bent backs, the hollow cough of damaged lungs. But in their eyes burned something that factory work had not been able to extinguish: the belief that conditions could be changed if enough people were willing to risk everything to make change happen. The organizers were ordinary workers who had chosen to become extraordinary through their willingness to sacrifice personal safety for collective benefit. They included weavers whose families had worked textile mills for generations, metal workers whose fathers had died in industrial accidents, women whose children had been consumed by machinery designed with no regard for human safety. These leaders understood that individual resistance was futile, but collective action might force even the most powerful employers to negotiate. Communication between workers required elaborate codes and secret signals, as factory owners employed networks of informants who reported on any suspicious conversations or gatherings. Messages about meetings were passed through chains of trusted intermediaries, embedded in seemingly innocent conversations about family or weather. The development of this underground communication system transformed workers from isolated individuals into members of a hidden community united by shared purpose. The first strikes were desperate gambles that often ended in defeat and retribution. Workers who participated faced immediate firing, eviction from company housing, and blacklisting that could make them unemployable throughout entire regions. Their families suffered alongside them, as employers deliberately targeted strikers' wives and children for additional punishment designed to break the spirit of anyone who dared to resist industrial authority. Violence became a constant threat as factory owners hired private armies to suppress worker organizing through intimidation, assault, and sometimes murder. These hired thugs, often recruited from criminal backgrounds, attacked union meetings, beat organizers, and created climates of terror designed to convince workers that resistance was more dangerous than submission. The lack of legal protection for workers meant that such violence occurred with impunity, sanctioned by courts that consistently ruled in favor of property owners over human rights. Some organizers paid the ultimate price for their courage, becoming martyrs whose deaths inspired rather than deterred future resistance. These fallen leaders were remembered in secret ceremonies and quiet songs that passed their stories from one generation of workers to the next. Their sacrifices created a legacy of resistance that survived even the most brutal attempts at suppression, proving that ideas could be more durable than the people who first expressed them. Women played crucial roles in early labor organizing, despite facing additional barriers and dangers beyond those encountered by their male colleagues. Female workers organized boycotts, maintained communication networks, and provided support for families of striking workers. Their participation challenged not only industrial exploitation, but also social conventions that sought to confine women to passive roles in economic and political struggles. Children became unwitting participants in labor resistance as their parents struggled to balance family survival with political action. Some young workers joined organizing efforts despite their age, recognizing that their futures depended on changing conditions that were already destroying their bodies and spirits. Others suffered when their parents' political activities resulted in economic retaliation that reduced already inadequate family resources. The solidarity that developed among striking workers created temporary communities that functioned according to principles of mutual aid and shared sacrifice, rather than individual competition. Families with slightly more resources shared with those who had less, creating support networks that sustained resistance longer than employers had expected. These experiences of cooperation provided glimpses of alternative ways of organizing economic relationships. International connections began to form as workers realized that industrial exploitation was not limited to their local factories, but represented a global system that required coordinated resistance. Letters and visitors carried information about organizing techniques, successful strikes, and effective strategies between different countries and regions. These connections helped workers understand that their struggles were part of a worldwide movement for human dignity and economic justice. The gradual development of labor organizations provided structure and continuity that individual acts of resistance could not achieve. These early unions, despite constant harassment and legal challenges, created institutions that could survive the imprisonment or death of individual leaders. They developed constitutions, elected leadership, and formal procedures that transformed spontaneous resistance into organized political action. Legal battles became another front in the struggle for workers' rights, as organizers challenged laws that prohibited union activity and sought court protections for workers' basic human rights. Although most early legal efforts failed, they established precedents and arguments that future generations of workers could build upon in their own struggles for justice and dignity. The courage of these early organizers planted seeds that would eventually grow into labor movements capable of forcing fundamental changes in industrial employment. Their willingness to risk everything for the possibility of better conditions created examples that inspired future generations of workers to continue the struggle for human dignity in industrial society. Chapter 14: The Gradual Awakening. The first cracks in the industrial system's facade of inevitability appeared not from worker resistance alone, but from the gradual awakening of middle-class reformers who discovered that the prosperity they enjoyed was built upon systematic human suffering. These investigators, journalists, and politicians began to document conditions in factories and slums, creating a record of industrial brutality that even the most callous observers found difficult to ignore. Parliamentary commissions began conducting formal investigations into working conditions, though their initial efforts were hampered by factory owners who refused access, threatened witnesses, and attempted to present sanitized versions of industrial employment. The commissioners who persisted in their investigations often emerged from factory visits pale and shaken, having witnessed conditions that challenged their fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. The testimonies of child workers proved particularly powerful in shifting public opinion, as even the most hardened supporters of industrial capitalism found it difficult to justify the systematic destruction of innocence that factory employment required. Children as young as 6 testified about working 16-hour days, crawling under dangerous machinery, and suffering injuries that would mark them for life. These accounts, preserved in official records, created documentary evidence of horrors that factory owners could no longer deny or minimize. Reformist publications began printing detailed descriptions of factory conditions alongside illustrations that showed the physical toll of industrial employment on workers' bodies. These images, widely circulated among middle-class readers who had never seen the inside of a factory, created emotional responses that statistics alone could not generate. The visual evidence of industrial brutality proved more persuasive than economic arguments about efficiency and profit. Religious leaders gradually began to speak out against working conditions that they recognized as incompatible with Christian teachings about human dignity and social responsibility. Ministers who had previously avoided political topics began delivering sermons that challenged the morality of industrial practices, creating pressure on factory owners who valued their standing in respectable society. This religious awakening provided moral authority for reform movements that had previously relied primarily on economic and political arguments. The first factory acts represented tentative steps toward government regulation of industrial employment, though these early laws were limited in scope and poorly enforced. The legislation typically applied only to specific industries or age groups, leaving most workers unprotected while creating the illusion of comprehensive reform. Factory owners often ignored these regulations entirely, knowing that enforcement mechanisms were inadequate and penalties were minimal. Factory inspectors, when they were appointed, faced enormous challenges in monitoring compliance with labor laws across vast industrial regions. These officials were often outnumbered, underfunded, and subject to political pressure from factory owners who had connections to government officials. Despite these limitations, some inspectors courageously documented violations and pursued prosecutions that established important precedents for worker protection. The development of labor legislation created new categories of legal thinking about the relationship between workers and employers, challenging traditional concepts of property rights and contractual freedom. Legal scholars began to argue that some working conditions were so inherently dangerous or exploitative that they should be prohibited regardless of workers' apparent consent. These intellectual developments laid groundwork for more comprehensive labor protections in future generations. Educational reformers began advocating for compulsory schooling laws that would remove children from factory employment and provide them with skills needed for alternative forms of work. These efforts faced fierce resistance from factory owners who depended on child labor and from families who needed their children's wages for survival. The gradual implementation of education requirements represented a fundamental shift in society's understanding of childhood and human development. Medical professionals began documenting the specific health effects of industrial employment, creating scientific evidence that connected workplace conditions to disease and death. These studies provided objective data that reformers could use to argue for workplace safety regulations and compensation systems for injured workers. The medical evidence also helped workers understand that their suffering was not inevitable, but resulted from specific, changeable conditions. International comparisons began to embarrass British factory owners as reformers pointed to more humane working conditions in other countries that had implemented stronger labor protections. These comparisons challenged arguments that worker exploitation was necessary for economic competitiveness, demonstrating that industrial development could proceed without the extreme brutality that characterized British factories. Women's rights advocates connected industrial reform to broader questions about social justice and human equality, arguing that protecting workers required fundamental changes in how society valued human life relative to property rights. These activists helped expand the scope of labor reform beyond immediate workplace issues to include housing, education, and political representation for working-class families. The growing influence of newspapers and literacy among working-class populations created new opportunities for reformers to communicate directly with workers about their rights and the possibility of change. Publications dedicated to labor issues provided workers with information about organizing techniques, legal protections, and successful reform efforts in other regions. This expanding access to information helped workers understand that their individual suffering was part of larger patterns that could be addressed through collective action. Economic arguments for reform began to emerge as some observers recognized that healthy, educated workers might be more productive than exploited, damaged ones. These utilitarian arguments provided common ground between reformers motivated by humanitarian concerns and business leaders interested primarily in long-term profitability. While these economic justifications were limited in scope, they created opportunities for practical reforms that improved working conditions. The accumulation of reform efforts, despite their individual limitations, began to create momentum for more comprehensive changes in industrial employment. Each small victory demonstrated that factory conditions were not immutable laws of nature, but human arrangements that could be modified through organized effort and political pressure. This gradual awakening provided hope for workers who had previously seen no possibility of escape from industrial suffering. Chapter 15: Legacy of Suffering. The Victorian factory workers whose lives were consumed by industrial machinery left behind more than broken bodies and early graves. Their suffering became the foundation upon which modern labor rights were built, their sacrifices creating a legacy that extends far beyond the smoke-stained cities where they lived and died. Every workplace safety regulation, every minimum wage law, every protection for workers represents a monument to their endurance and a recognition of a human cost of unregulated industrial development. The physical transformation of entire generations created a historical record written in bone and tissue, as medical researchers studying industrial workers documented the systematic damage caused by uncontrolled factory employment. These studies, conducted decades after the worst abuses, revealed that entire populations had been effectively used as experimental subjects in an uncontrolled study of human tolerance for industrial toxins and mechanical stress. The demographic impact of industrial employment could be measured in the shortened lifespans and reduced reproductive capacity of working-class families who bore the primary cost of mechanization. Cemetery records from industrial districts tell stories of families where children died before parents, where wives outlived husbands by decades, where entire bloodlines were extinguished by the combined effects of workplace accidents, industrial diseases, and poverty-related malnutrition. The social disruption caused by factory employment created new forms of human organization that would influence political and economic development for generations. The experience of industrial work taught workers that individual resistance was futile, but collective action could force even powerful employers to negotiate. This lesson became the foundation for labor movements that would eventually reshape the relationship between workers and capital throughout the industrialized world. Cultural changes emerged from the industrial experience as working-class communities developed new forms of solidarity, communication, and resistance that challenged traditional social hierarchies. Songs, stories, and informal networks that sustained workers through their darkest periods became part of a working-class culture that valued collective welfare over individual advancement. These cultural innovations provided models for social organization that influenced political movements far beyond the factory districts where they originated. The legal system was forced to evolve in response to industrial working conditions that existing laws could not adequately address. Traditional concepts of property rights, contractual freedom, and individual responsibility proved inadequate for regulating employment relationships, where workers had no meaningful choice and employers wielded absolute power. The gradual development of labor law represented a fundamental shift in legal thinking about the balance between economic efficiency and human welfare. International development was shaped by the British industrial experience as other countries observed the human cost of unregulated mechanization and sought alternative approaches to economic modernization. The suffering of British workers became a cautionary tale that influenced labor legislation and social policies in countries that industrialized later, demonstrating that economic development did not require the extreme exploitation that characterized early British factories. Educational systems were transformed by recognition that industrial employment required different forms of human development than agricultural or craft work. The gradual implementation of compulsory education reflected growing understanding that modern economies needed workers with basic literacy and numeracy skills, but it also represented acknowledgement that children deserve protection from industrial exploitation regardless of their economic value to employers. Urban planning emerged as a discipline partly in response to the horrific living conditions that characterized industrial districts, as reformers recognized that decent housing and sanitation were prerequisites for maintaining healthy working populations. The slums that housed factory workers became examples of how not to organize human communities, inspiring efforts to create more humane environments for working-class families. Medical understanding advanced through study of industrial diseases that had never existed before mechanization, as doctors learned to diagnose and treat conditions caused by exposure to industrial chemicals, repetitive motions, and dangerous machinery. This medical knowledge, purchased with workers' suffering, eventually contributed to occupational health sciences that could prevent rather than simply treat workplace injuries and illnesses. Political consciousness developed among working-class populations who learned through bitter experience that their economic interests conflicted with those of their employers, creating awareness that political power was necessary to protect workers' basic human rights. This consciousness became the foundation for democratic movements that extended political participation beyond traditional elites to include working people whose labor created the wealth that sustained industrial societies. Economic theory was challenged by industrial working conditions that revealed the limitations of market mechanisms for protecting human welfare, leading to recognition that some aspects of employment relationships required government regulation rather than relying on voluntary agreements between parties with vastly unequal power. This theoretical development justified interventions in labor markets that previous generations of economists had considered illegitimate interference with natural economic laws. The global spread of industrialization carried with it awareness of the human cost documented in British factories, creating international movements for workers' rights that transcended national boundaries. Labor organizations, reform movements, and political parties in different countries shared information about working conditions and organizing strategies, creating networks of solidarity that helped workers resist exploitation more effectively than isolated local efforts could achieve. Technological development was eventually influenced by recognition that machinery designed without regard for human safety and welfare created unnecessary suffering and economic inefficiency. The gradual incorporation of safety features and ergonomic principles into industrial equipment reflected growing understanding that protecting workers was compatible with productive efficiency, though this recognition came too late for the generations who had already been sacrificed to unregulated mechanization. The memory of Victorian factory workers' suffering continues to influence contemporary debates about globalization, labor standards, and economic development, as their experience provides historical evidence of what happens when economic growth takes priority over human welfare. Their legacy serves as a reminder that prosperity built on systematic exploitation is ultimately unsustainable, and that protecting workers' rights is essential for creating just and stable societies. Chapter 16: The Fire That Still Burns. The story of Victorian factory workers ends not with their deaths, but with the recognition that their struggle continues in new forms across the modern world. The same forces that drove children into dangerous machinery and poison workers with industrial chemicals still operate today, seeking profits through human exploitation wherever regulatory systems are weak and workers lack the power to defend themselves. In distant factories where global supply chains begin, the echoes of Victorian suffering reverberate through workshops where workers toil for wages that cannot support basic human needs, in buildings that collapse because safety regulations are ignored, under conditions that would have been familiar to the textile workers of Manchester or the metal workers of Birmingham. The machinery has changed, but the fundamental relationship between capital and labor remains marked by the same power imbalances that characterized industrial employment 2 centuries ago. The lessons written in the blood and broken bones of Victorian workers inform contemporary struggles for workplace safety, living wages, and basic human dignity in employment relationships. Every successful campaign for labor rights builds upon foundations laid by workers who face down factory owners with nothing but their willingness to sacrifice individual security for collective benefit. Their courage continues to inspire new generations of workers who confront different forms of exploitation but face similar choices between submission and resistance. Modern labor movements inherit both the tactical knowledge and the moral authority developed by Victorian workers who proved that organized resistance could force powerful employers to negotiate despite seemingly overwhelming disadvantages. The strategies of solidarity, collective action, and political engagement that emerged from industrial districts continue to provide blueprints for contemporary workers seeking to improve their conditions and protect their rights. The regulatory frameworks that protect workers in developed countries represent the gradual implementation of principles first articulated by Victorian labor organizers, who argued that human welfare should take precedence over profit maximization. These protections, imperfect though they remain, demonstrate that the suffering of early industrial workers was not in vain if their experience contributed to creating more humane working conditions for future generations. International labor standards reflect growing recognition that workers' rights are universal human rights that cannot be sacrificed for economic competitiveness, a principle that emerged from documentation of conditions in Victorian factories that shocked the conscience of observers who had previously accepted exploitation as inevitable. The International Labor Organization and similar institutions represent attempts to prevent the worst abuses of early industrialization from being repeated in countries undergoing economic development. The environmental movement draws connections between the industrial practices that poison Victorian workers and contemporary threats to global ecosystems, recognizing that the same disregard for long-term consequences that characterized early factory employment continues to shape business decisions that affect planetary health. The toxic legacy of industrial development serves as a warning about the ultimate costs of prioritizing short-term profits over sustainable practices. Corporate social responsibility initiatives, however limited in scope, acknowledge that businesses have obligations to workers and communities beyond simply maximizing shareholder returns. This recognition represents a fundamental shift from the Victorian era, when factory owners felt no responsibility for the welfare of their employees beyond paying wages sufficient to maintain a workforce. The gradual acceptance of broader business responsibilities reflects the influence of arguments first made by reformers who challenged the morality of industrial exploitation. Educational systems that emphasize critical thinking and social awareness prepare new generations to recognize and resist exploitation, building upon foundations laid by reformers who argued that democracy required an educated citizenry capable of understanding complex economic and political relationships. The knowledge that working people need to defend their interests continues to expand, informed by historical understanding of how exploitation operates and how it can be effectively challenged. Technology development increasingly incorporates principles of human-centered design that prioritize worker safety and welfare, representing a gradual shift away from the Victorian approach of designing machinery solely for productive efficiency. This evolution reflects growing recognition that sustainable productivity requires protecting the human resources upon which all economic activity ultimately depends. The moral imagination expanded by Victorian workers' suffering continues to challenge contemporary observers to recognize exploitation wherever it occurs and to respond with the same courage demonstrated by workers who risked everything to demand basic human dignity. Their example provides both inspiration and practical guidance for anyone who confronts systems that treat human beings as disposable resources rather than as people deserving of respect and protection. The fire of resistance that burned in Victorian factory districts continues to illuminate the darkness of contemporary exploitation, providing light for workers who struggle against modern forms of industrial brutality. That fire burns in every successful organizing campaign, every workplace safety improvement, every victory for living wages and basic human rights. It burns in the recognition that economic systems exist to serve human needs rather than the reverse, and that working people have both the right and the responsibility to demand that their labor contributes to building more just and humane societies. The Victorian factory workers' legacy lives not in monuments or museums, but in the ongoing struggle for human dignity in industrial relationships. Their suffering was not meaningless if it contributed to creating awareness that exploitation is neither inevitable nor acceptable, and their courage continues to inspire resistance to systems that would reduce human beings to mere factors of production. The fire they lit continues to burn, waiting to be carried forward by new generations of workers who refuse to accept that prosperity must be built upon a foundation of human suffering.